Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now, and will be easier to solve while rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Before we get on with the show, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to ask for some support. If you are finding Sleepy Time Tales helpful, and you have the means, and you would like to help support it, to help me to keep it ad-free and going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, please consider supporting the show on Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is a monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but can also get you fun bonuses based on how much you contribute. From as little as $2 a month, you get weekly access to early release on the main episodes, and if you jump up to only $5 a month, you get weekly bonus minisodes, special edits of the main episode, and a monthly megasode, which is all the month's releases in one big listen. But monthly may seem like a big ask. Times can be tough for a lot of people after all. So if you would like to make a once-off contribution, you can do so through buymeacoffee.com/sleepytimetales or the tip jar on the website. I've also got some very basic merchandise up in a TeePublic store, which you can reach through the show notes or via the website at sleepytimetales.net. But other than helping financially, the other big way you can help the show is simply to spread the word. If you find Sleepy Time Tales helpful, and you know someone who is struggling to sleep and might find it useful for them, then please just tell them about it. If you do so on social media, please make sure to tag me in at Sleepy Time Tales on Instagram or Twitter so that I can see and I can thank you. Last but not least, of course, I got to shout out the music, which is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiku. Their music is available on their website at royaltyfreakmusic.com. Thanks for taking the time. Let's get back to the show. So what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales? What is it for? What is this strange idea, this podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to? But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, mind spinning and emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Sleepy Time Tales is intended to be used as a distraction to what keeps you awake at night, or maybe sometimes background noise or company. That's why I make these episodes quite long, so that I'm here for you, without any pressure of the end coming. Now, as far as I know, there are a couple of different ways to engage with the show. The main idea is that it gives you something to focus on, a story or an event that lets you keep your mind on a specific point, to stop it from spinning out into stress and anxieties, to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of a night's sleep when it comes for you. But there may be a second way. Maybe you're someone that just needs something in the background. These days, people sometimes just like white noise, or the sound of the ocean, or the wind in the trees, or maybe some boring dude just droning on in the background. What matters though is you don't try to force the sleep. Just keep a light mental grip on the thread of the story and allow the need for sleep to come for you. Now I'm hopeful that you will be asleep before I get to the end of the episode, but it's important not to feel pressurized. It may not work on the first night. It'll probably take a few nights for you to get used to listening to my voice. Maybe my accent is strange to you, or maybe early on at least one episode just isn't long enough. Or maybe your problem isn't so much falling asleep. Maybe you fall asleep alright and you wake up in the middle of the night. what I recommend is to let the podcast run all night. The best thing to do is download a whole bunch of episodes into your podcatcher of choice, put them in a playlist. When you go to sleep, start with the latest and let them go. That way, if you wake up and find yourself staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., you can just pop your earbuds back in and allow yourself to go straight back to sleep again. Or maybe you even wake up a little bit before your alarm, 60 minutes or even 30 minutes. What I recommend in that case is the same thing as if it was 3 a.m. Carry on listening and go right back to sleep again. And you may want to say, Dave, what is the point of that? What good is an extra 30 minutes of sleep to me? But I can tell you now that I find it very useful, and I've had people thank me for making this recommendation. Because there's something about allowing yourself complete relaxation right before the alarm that's satisfying on a whole new level. But whether it's first thing at night, middle of the night, late in the morning, the important thing is that you try to relax. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this will probably seem strange to you. So give it a chance. Because I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. A History of Art for Beginners and Students by Clara, Erskine, Clement, Waters. Painting. Chapter 1. Ancient Painting, from the earliest times to the Christian era. In speaking of art, we often contrast the useful or mechanical arts with the fine arts. By these terms we denote the difference between the arts which are used in making such things as are necessary and useful in civilized life, and the arts by which ornamental and beautiful things are made. The fine arts are architecture, sculpture, painting, poetry, and music. And though we could live if none of these existed, yet life would be far from the pleasant experience that it is often made to be through the enjoyment of these arts. In speaking of painting, just here I wish to include the more general idea of pictures of various sorts. And it seems to me that while picture-making belongs to the fine or beautiful arts, it is now made a very useful art in many ways. For example, when a schoolbook is illustrated, how much more easily we understand the subject we are studying through the help we get from the pictures of objects or places that we have not seen, and yet wish to know about. Pictures of natural scenery bring all countries before our eyes in such a way that by looking at them while reading books of travel, we may know a great deal more about lands we have never seen, and may never be able to visit. Who does not love pictures? And what a pleasure it is to open a magazine or book filled with fine illustrations. St. Augustine, who wrote in the 4th century after Christ, said that pictures are the books of the simple or unlearned. This is just as true now as then, and we should regard pictures as one of the most agreeable means of education. Thus, one of the uses of pictures is that they give us a clear idea of what we have not seen. A second use is that they excite our imaginations, and often help us to forget disagreeable circumstances and unpleasant surroundings. The cultivation of the imagination is very important, because in this way we can add much to our individual happiness. Through this power, if we are in a dark, narrow street, in a house which is not to our liking, or in the midst of any unpleasant happenings, we are able to fix our thoughts upon a photograph or picture that may be there, and by studying it we are able to imagine ourselves far, far away, in some spot where nature makes everything pleasant, and soothes us into forgetfulness of all that can disturb our happiness. Many an invalid, many an unfortunate one is thus made content by pictures during hours that would otherwise be wretched. This is the result of cultivating the perceptive and imaginative faculties, and when once this is done, we have a source of pleasure within ourselves, and not dependent on others, which can never be taken from us. It often happens that we see two persons who do the same work, and are situated in the same way in the world, who are very different in their manner. One is light-hearted and happy, the other heavy and sad. If you can find out the truth, it will result that the sad one is matter-of-fact, and has no imagination. He can only think of his work and what concerns him personally. But the merry one would surprise you if you could read his thoughts, if you could know the distances they have passed over and what a vast difference there is between his thought and his work. So while it is natural for almost everyone to exclaim joyfully at the beauty of pictures, and to enjoy looking at them simply, I wish my readers to think of their uses also, and understand the benefits that may be derived from them. I have only hinted at a few of these uses, but many others will occur to you. When pictures are composed of beautiful colors, such as we usually think of when we speak of the art of painting, the greatest charm of pictures is reached, and all civilized people have admired and encouraged this art. It is true that the remains of ancient art now existing are principally those of architecture or sculpture. Yet there are a sufficient number of pictures in color to prove how old the art of painting is. Egypt. Egyptian painting is principally found on the walls of temples and tombs, upon columns and cornices, and on small articles found in burial places. There is no doubt that it was used as a decoration, but it was also intended to be useful, and was so employed as to tell the history of the country, its wars with their conquests and triumphs, and the lives of the kings. And many other stories are just as distinctly told by pictures as by hieroglyphics or Egyptian writings. We can scarcely say that Egyptian painting is beautiful, but it is certainly very interesting. The Egyptians had three kinds of painting: one on flat surfaces, a second on bas-reliefs, or designs a little raised and then colored, and a third on designs in intaglio, or hollowed out from the flat surfaces, and the colors applied to the figures thus cut out. They had no knowledge of what we call perspective, that is, the art of representing a variety of objects on one flat surface and making them appear to be at different distances from us. And you will see from the illustrations given here that their drawing and their manner of expressing the meaning of what they painted was very crude. As far as the pictorial effect is concerned, there is very little difference between the three modes of Egyptian painting. Their general appearance is very nearly the same. The Egyptian artist sacrificed everything to the one consideration of telling his story clearly. The way in which he did this was sometimes very amusing, such as the making one man twice as tall as another in order to signify that he was of high position, such as a king or an officer of high rank. When figures are represented as following each other, those that are behind are frequently taller than those in front, and sometimes those that are furthest back are arranged in rows, with the feet of one row entirely above the heads of the others. This illustration of the storming of a fort by a king and his sons will show you what I mean. The sons are intended to be represented as following the father, and are in a row, one above the other. For the representation of water, a strip of blue filled in with perpendicular zigzag black lines was used. From these few facts, you can understand how unformed and awkward Egyptian pictures seem if we compare them with the existing idea of what is beautiful. There appear to have been certain fixed rules for the use of colors, and certain objects are always painted in the colors prescribed for them. The background of a picture was always of a single solid color. Egyptian men were painted in a reddish-brown, and horses were of the same shade. Women were generally yellow, sometimes a lighter brown than the men. Negroes are race, Asiatic race is yellow, and but one instance is known of a white skin, blue eyes and yellow hair. The draperies about the figures were painted in pleasing colors, and were sometimes transparent, so that the figures could be seen through them. The execution of Egyptian paintings was very mechanical. One set of workmen prepared the plaster on the wall for the reception of the colors. Another set drew all the outlines in red. Then, if chiseling was to be done, another class performed this labor. And finally, still others put on the colors. Of course, nothing could be much more matter-of-fact than such painting as this. And under such rules, an artist of the most lofty genius and imagination would find it impossible to express his conceptions in his work. We know all this because some of the pictures exist in unfinished condition and are left in the various stages of execution. Then, too, there are other pictures of the painters at their work, and all these different processes are shown in them. The outline drawing is the very best part of Egyptian painting, and this is frequently very cleverly done. As I have intimated, the greatest value of Egyptian painting is that it gives us a clear record of the habits and customs of a very ancient people, of a civilization which has long since passed away, and which we should have a comparatively vague and unsatisfactory notion, but for this picture history of it. The religion, the political history, and the domestic life of the ancient Egyptians are all placed before us in these paintings. Through a study of them, we know just how they hunted and fished, gathered their fruits, tilled the soil, and cooked the food, played games, danced and practiced gymnastics, conducted their scenes of festivity and mourning. In short, how they lived under all circumstances. Thus you see that Egyptian painting is a very important example of the way in which pictures can teach you. You will also notice that it is not even necessary that they should be pretty in order that we may learn from them. Another use made of Egyptian painting was the illustration of the papyrus rolls upon which historical and other documents were written. These rolls, found in the tombs, are now placed in museums and collections of curious things. The paintings upon them may be called the oldest book illustrations in the world. Sometimes a single color is used, such as red or black, but others are in a variety of colors, which have been put on with a brush. Indeed, some rolls exist which have pictures only, and are entirely without hieroglyphics or writing characters. One such is more than 20 yards long and contains nothing but pictures of funeral ceremonies. The ancient Egyptians were so serious a people that it is a pleasant surprise to find that some of these pictures are intended for jokes and satires, somewhat like those of the comic papers of today. For example, there is one in the British Museum, London, representing cats and rats fighting, which is intended to ridicule the soldiers and heroes of the Egyptian army. One cannot study Egyptian painting without feeling sorry for the painters, for in all the enormous amount of work done by them, no one man was recognized. No one is now remembered. We know some of the names of great Egyptian architects which are written in the historical rolls, but no painter's name has been thus preserved. The fact that no greater progress was made is a proof of the discouraging influences that must have been around these artists, for it is not possible that none of them had imagination or originality. There must have been some whose souls were filled with poetic visions, for some of the Egyptian writings show that poetry existed in ancient Egypt. But of what use could imagination be to artists who are governed by the laws of a narrow priesthood, and hedged about by superstitious religion, which even laid down rules for art? For these reasons we know something of Egyptian art, and nothing of Egyptian artists. And from all these influences it follows that Egyptian painting is little more than an illuminated alphabet, or a child's picture history. In the hieroglyphics or writing characters of Egypt, it often occurs that small pictures of certain animals or other objects stand for whole words, and it appears that this idea was carried into Egyptian painting, which by this means became simply a picture chronicle, and never reached a point where it could be called truly artistic or a high art. Assyria. The remains of Assyrian paintings are so few that they scarcely serve any other purpose than to prove that the Assyrians were accustomed to decorate their walls with pictures. Sometimes the walls were prepared with plaster, and the designs were painted on that. In other cases, the painting was done upon the brick itself. The paintings on plaster were usually on the inner walls, and many of these which have been discovered during the excavations have disappeared when exposed to the air after their long burial from the sight and knowledge of the world. Speaking of these pictures, the writer on art, J. Oppert, says that some paintings were found on the palace of Sargon. They represented gods, lions, rosettes, and various other designs. But when he reached Nineveh 1 year after these discoveries, the pictures had all disappeared. The colors, which had been buried 2,500 years, lasted but a few days after they were uncovered. Assyrian tile painting was more durable than wall painting, but in all the excavations that have been made, these have been found only in fragments, and from these fragments no complete picture has been put together. The largest one was found at Nimrud, and our illustration is taken from it. It represents a king, as we know by the tiara he wears, and 2 servants who follow him. The pictures to which the existing fragments belong could not have been large. The figures on our picture are but 9 inches high. A few pieces have been found which must have belonged to larger pictures, and there is one which shows a part of a face belonging to a figure at least 3 feet high. But this is very unusual. The Assyrian paintings have a broad outline, which is of a lighter color than the rest of the picture. It is generally white or yellow. There are very few colors used in them. This does not accord with our notions of the dresses and stuffs of the Assyrians, for we suppose that they were rich and varied in color. Probably they had so few pigments that they could not represent in their paintings all the colors they knew. No one can give a very satisfactory account of Assyrian paintings. But, judging from the little of it which remains, and from the immense number of Assyrian sculptures which exist, we may conclude that the chief aim of Assyrian artists was to represent each object they saw with absolute realism. The Dutch painters were remarkable for this trait, and for the patient attention which they gave to the details of their work. And for this reason, Oppert has called the Assyrians the Dutchmen of antiquity. Babylon. In Babylon, in the 6th century BC, under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, the art of tile painting reached a high state of perfection. The Babylonians had no such splendid alabaster as had the Assyrians. Now they had their limestone, so they could not make fine sculptured slabs such as are found at Nineveh and in other Assyrian ruins. But the Babylons had a fine clay, and they learned how to use it to the best advantage. The city of Babylon shone with richly colored tiles, and one traveler writes, "By the side of Assyria, her colder and severer sister of the north, Babylon showed herself a true child of the south. Rich, glowing, careless of the rules of taste, only desiring to awaken admiration by the dazzling brilliance of her appearance." Many of the Babylonish tiles are in regular set patterns in rich tints. Some are simply in solid colors. These last are found in the famous terrace temple of Bossipe, near Babylon. We know from ancient writings that there were decorative paintings in Babylon, which represented hunting seasons and like subjects. And according to the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 23, verse 14, there were men portrayed upon the wall, the images of the Chaldeans portrayed with vermilion, girded with girdles upon their loins, exceeding in dyed attire upon their heads, all of them princes to look to, after the manner of Babylonians of Chaldea, the land of their nativity. Some writers assume that this must have been a description of tapestries, but most authorities believe them to have been glazed tile paintings. A whole cargo of fragments of Babylonish tile paintings was once collected for the gallery of the Louvre at Paris, and when on board a ship and ready to be sent away, by some accident the hull was sunk. From the descriptions of them which were written, we find that there were portions of pictures of human faces, and other parts of the body, of animals, mountains, and forests, of water, walls, and trees. Judging from what still remains, the art of painting was far less important, and much less advanced among the Eastern or Oriental nations, than were those of architecture and sculpture. It is very strange that these peoples, who seem to have observed nature closely and to have mastered the mathematical sciences, made no steps toward the discovery of the laws of perspective. Neither did they know how to give any expression of thought or feeling to the human face. In truth, their pictures were a mere repetition of set figures, and were only valuable as pieces of colored decorations for walls, adding a pleasing richness and variety by their different tints, but almost worthless as works of art. Ancient Greece and Italy. The painting of Greece and that of ancient Italy are so much the same that it is almost impossible to speak of them separately. The art of painting was carried from Greece to Italy by the Etruscans, and the art of ancient Rome was simply that of Greece transplanted. If Greek artists were employed by Romans, certainly the works were Greek. And if Romans painted, they aimed to imitate the Greeks exactly, so that Italian painting, before the time of the Christian era, must be considered together with that of Greece. In architecture and sculpture, the ancient Greeks accepted what had been done by the Egyptians and Assyrians as a foundation, and went on to perfect the work of the older nations through the aid of poetic and artistic imaginations. But in painting, the Greeks followed nothing that had preceded them. They were the first to make pictures which were a lifelike reproduction of what they saw about them. They were the first to separate painting from sculpture, and to give it such importance as would permit it to have its own place, quite free from the influence of any other art, and in its own way as grand and beautiful as its sister arts. There are writers who trace the origin and progress of Greek painting from the very earliest times, but I shall begin with the Apollodorus, who is spoken of as the first Greek painter worthy of fame, because he was the first one who knew how to make his pictures appear to be real, and to follow the rules of perspective, so as to have a background from which his figures stood out, and to shade his colors and soften his outlines. He was very famous, and was called Skeographos, which means shadow painter. Apollodorus was an Athenian and lived about the close of the 5th century BC. Although he was a remarkable artist then, we must not fancy that his pictures would have satisfied our idea of beautiful. In fact, Pliny the historian, who saw his pictures 600 years later at Pergamos, says that Apollodorus was but the gatekeeper who threw open the gates of painting to the famous artists who lived after him. Zeuxis was a pupil of Apollodorus and a great artist also. He was born in Heraclea, probably in Lower Italy. When young, he led a wandering life. He studied at Athens under Apollodorus and settled in Ephesus. He was in the habit of putting his pictures on exhibition and charging an admittance fee, such as artists do now. He called himself the unsurpassable, and said and did many vain and foolish things. Near the end of his life, he considered his pictures as beyond any price, and so gave them away. Upon one of his works he wrote, "Easier to carp at than to copy." It is said that he actually laughed himself to death from amusement at one of his own pictures, which represented an old woman. Zeuxis had a rival in the painter Parrhasius, and their names are often associated. On one occasion they made trial of their artistic skill. Zeuxis painted a bunch of grapes so naturally that the birds came to peck at them. Then Parrhasius painted a hanging curtain, and when his picture was exposed to the public, Zeuxis asked him to draw aside his curtain, fully believing it to be of cloth and concealing a picture behind it. Thus it was judged that Parrhasius was the best artist, for he had deceived Zeuxis, while the latter had only deceived the birds. From these stories it appears that these artists tried to imitate objects with great exactness. Parrhasius too was a vain man, and went about in a purple robe with gold wreath upon his head, and gold clasps on his sandals. He painted his own portrait, and called it the god Hermes or Mercury. He wrote praises of himself in which he called himself by many high-sounding names, for all of which he was much ridiculed by others. However, both these artists were surpassed by Timanthes, according to the ancient writers, who relate that he engaged in a trial of skill with Parrhasius, and came off the victor in it. The fame of his picture of the sacrifices Iphigenia was very great, and its one excellence seems to have been in the varied expression on its faces. The descriptions of this great work lead to the belief that this Pompeian wall painting, from which we give a cut, closely resembles that of Timanthes, which no longer exists. The story of Iphigenia says that when her father, King Agamemnon, killed a hart which was sacred to Diana or Artemis, that the goddess becalmed his fleet so that he could not sail to Troy. Then the seer Calchas advised the king to sacrifice his daughter in order to appease the wrath of Diana. Agamemnon consented, but it is said that the goddess was so sorry for the maiden that she bore her away to Taurus and made her a priestess, and left her heart to be sacrificed instead of Iphigenia. In our cut you see Calchas on the right. 2 men are bearing the maiden to her doom, while her father stands on the left, with his head veiled from sight. Zeuxis, Parrhasius, and Timanthes belonged to the Ionian school of painting, which flourished during the Peloponnesian War. The school was excelled by that of Sicyon, which reached its highest prosperity between the end of the Peloponnesian War and the death of Alexander the Great. The chief reason why this Dorian school at Sicyon was so fine was that here, for the first time, the pupils followed a regular course of study, and were trained in drawing and mathematics, and taught to observe nature with the strictest attention. The most famous master of the school was Pausias, Some of his works were carried to Rome, where they were much admired. His picture of the garland weaver Clara gained him a great name, and by it he earned the greatest reputation as a flower painter that is known in the history of art. Nicomachos, who lived at Thebes around 360 BC, was famous for the rapidity with which he painted pictures that were excellent in their completeness and beauty. Aristides, the son or brother of Nicomachos, was so good an artist that Attalus, king of Pergamos, offered more than £20,000, or $100,000, for his picture of Dionysus or Bacchus. This wonderful picture was carried to Rome and preserved in the temple of Ceres, but it no longer exists. Euphranor was another great painter, and was distinguished for his power to give great expression to the faces, and a manly force to the figures which he painted. Nicias, the Athenian, is said to have been so devoted to his art that he could think of nothing else. He would ask his servants if he had bathed or eaten, not being able to remember for himself. He was very rich, and when King Ptolemy of Egypt offered him more than $60,000 for his picture of Ulysses in the underworld, he refused this great sum, and gave the painting to his native city. Nicias seems to have greatly exalted and respected his art, for he contended that painters should not fritter away time and talent on insignificant subjects, but ought rather to choose some grand event, such as a battle or a sea fight. His figures of women and his pictures of animals, especially those of dogs, were much praised. Some of his paintings were encaustic, that is to say, the colors were burned in. Thus they must have been made on plaster or pottery of some sort. Nicias outlived Alexander the Great, and saw the beginning of the school of painters to which the great Appallies belonged, that which is called the Hellenic school, in which Greek art reached its highest point. Appallies was the greatest of all Greek painters. He was born at Colophon, but as he made his first studies at Ephesus, he has been called an Ephesian. Later he studied in the school of Sicyon, but even when a pupil there, he was said to be the equal of all his instructors. Philip of Macedon heard of his fame and persuaded Appallies to remove to his capital city, which was called Pella. While there, Appallies became the friend of young Alexander, and when the latter came to the throne, he made Appallies his court painter, and is said to have issued an edict forbidding all other artists from painting his portrait. Later on, Appallies removed to Ephesus. During the early part of his artistic life, Appallies did little else than paint such pictures as exalted the fame of Philip, and afterward that of Alexander. He painted many portraits of both these great men. For one of Alexander, he received nearly $25,000. In it the monarch was represented as grasping the thunderbolt, as Jupiter might have done, and the hand appeared to be stretched out from the picture. This portrait was in the splendid temple of Diana, or Artemis, at Ephesus. Alexander was accustomed to say of it, "There are two Alexanders, one invincible, the living son of Philip, the other immutable, the picture of Appallies." Later in his life, Appallies painted many pictures of mythological subjects. He visited Alexandria. In Egypt, he did not win the favor of King Ptolemy, and his enemies in the Egyptian court played cruel practical jokes upon him. On one occasion he received an invitation to a feast at which the king had not desired his presence. The monarch was angry, but Appallies told him the truth, and appeased his wrath by sketching on the wall the exact likeness of the servant who had carried the invitation to him. However, Ptolemy remained unfavorable to him, and Appallies painted a great picture called Calumny, in which he represented those who had been his enemies, and thus held them up to the scorn of the world. Appallies visited Rhodes and Athens, but is thought to have died in the island of Kos, where he had painted two very beautiful pictures of the goddess Venus. One of these is called the Venus Anadyomene, or Venus rising from the sea. The Emperor Augustus carried this picture to Rome, and placed so high a value on it that he lessened the tribute money of the people of Kos 100 talents on account of it. The sum was about equal to $100,000 of our money. The art of Appallies was full of grace and sweetness, and the finish of his pictures was exquisite. The saying, "leave off in time," originated in his criticism of Protogenes, of whom he said that he was his superior, except that he did not know when to leave off, and by too much finishing lessened the effect of his work. Appallies was modest and generous. He was the first to praise Protogenes, and conferred a great benefit upon the latter by buying up his pictures, and giving out word that he was going to sell them as his own. Appallies was never afraid to correct those who were ignorant, and was equally ready to learn from anyone who could teach him anything. It is said that on one occasion, when Alexander was in his studio and talked of art, Appallies advised him to be silent, lest his color grinder should laugh at him. Again, when he had painted a picture and exposed it to public view, a cobbler pointed out a defect in the shoe latchet. Appallies changed it, but when the man next proceeded to criticize the leg of the figure, Appallies replied, "Cobbler, stick to your last." These sayings have descended to our own day, and have become classical. All these anecdotes from so remote a time are in a sense doubtful, but they are very interesting. Young people ought to be familiar with them, but it is also right to say that they are not known to be positively true. And on that little philosophical bit, I'm going to leave off for tonight. As always, if you'd like to pick up where we left off, I've got a link to the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes are released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiko. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.